Judge Grayson believed that the accused would denounce unsuspecting teenagers until they dismantled the case like experienced lawyers. The air in Los Angeles County courthouses felt thick and almost choking. The audience line filled the gallery and tweeted to each other as they saw how the scene unfolded. The accused's table looked too big for the young man standing next to it, his hands in his pocket, his chin lifted up enough to show that he was not afraid. Jalen Dawson, 19, denounced Grand Scheft Auto. 19, opposed the arrest. The charges were serious, but the way Judge Walter Grayson saw it made it clear that true legal proceedings had nothing to do with the law. Grayson leaned against his chair and drummed lazy on the polished wood of his desk. He tightened Jalen to the edge of his glasses, his lips turning into something between a smirk and an ock. "Do you think you are a legal expert of some sort?" His voice carries dry entertainment. "This is not a discussion club, kid." A few laughs made the court area. Enforcers, stenographers, and even prosecutors laugh. They were all joking. Jalen didn't throw it. He didn't laugh. He spent years preparing for this moment. It's not that he had no intention of standing here as defendant here, but he knew the court like the back of his hand. Other children remembered basketball statistics, but he learned case law. While his friend played video games, he made a false trial in his head, arguing with his own imaginary cases. His mother, Dennis Dawson, worked as a paralegal for over 20 years, but Jalen grew up to listen to stories she brought into the house as some advocates barely attempted as the prosecutors played favorites, as the judges played their favorites. He recorded everything. At 14, he was able to cut the process better than most law students. But this wasn't important to Grayson. For him, Jalen was just another child in trouble. "We'll do this quickly," the judge sighed, opening the case file. "I'm the second one playing the golf game." The audience laughed again, but this time something changed. Jalen's lips rolled into a weak, almost unperceived smile as Grayson just made his first mistake. However, the court had not yet noticed. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington rose from his seat with the already winning man's atmosphere. His suit was crisp. His tie was perfectly tied. His voice wore the rehearsed trust of someone who gave the same speech 100 times ago. "Your Honor, the state is undoubtedly proof that defendant Jalen Dawson was spoken about the 2022 Audi A6 in the stolen vehicle. Officials persecuted him through the city center, where they believed they had tried to escape before arresting him. His fingerprints were found on the handle. The prosecutor intervenes in what the evidence speaks for itself." The words landed on weight. The gallery crowd moved and whispered to each other. The stolen car sounded full on the surface. "I chased it." Judge Grayson threw Jalen on the edge of his glasses and returned to Carrington. "Amake." The prosecutor approached the GU judge, and his refined shoes clicked against the ground. "Defense can try to convince you that this is a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is a victim of an unfortunate situation." He turned around and choked his eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But we are honest. What victims are running from the police?" The tension in the room became thicker. Judge Grayson leaned forward and held his chin in his hand. Jalen did not flash. Carrington continued, engulfing leaves through stacks of paper. "Ray Honor, I have the testimony of Officer Daniel Lewis. Daniel Lewis personally saw the accused behind the wheel before attempting to escape. The car has been confirmed. The arrest was made by the book." Grayson breathed through his nose and nodded. "It sounds easy to me. And for most people in the room. The cases were clear cars, stolen cars, chasing, and arrests. But Jalen had studied too much for years to try not to see a crack. Nevertheless, he was silent and waited. Judge Grayson knocked his hammer a bit. Now we hear the defense response. He rarely said 3 words since he entered the courtroom. She stood up and moved nervously. "Your Honor, my client." Jalen placed her hand on her arm. Silent request. She hesitated and then sat down, and Jalen spoke for the first time. "I represent myself, Your Honor." The room was quiet. Grayson clearly stared at him. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice was calm and stable. "I will protect myself. Noise is spreading through the courts." The enforcer's eyebrows were shot. Carrington's smile stalled for just a second before leaving a sharp laugh. That should be interesting. But everything changed, and when Jalen took his first step, no one laughed. The weight of the court settled on Jalen when he adapted his attitude and his hands to his pockets. He only extended the silence a little longer enough to make it uncomfortable. Then he finally said, "Before I start, I want to check something with law enforcement." Carrington raised his eyebrows and crossed his arms. "Continue." Jalen took a slow step forward. "They said that before I was arrested, Officer Daniel Lewis personally saw me behind the wheel, correct?" Carrington let out a sharp breath and was already bored. "That's right. And this certificate is written in his report." Jalen nodded. "Of course." He then turned to Judge Grayson. Grayson blinked at him. "For what reason?" For the first time, Jalen pulled her hand out of her pocket and pointed to the prosecutor's table. "Because Officer Lewis has never seen me in this car. In fact, he wasn't on duty when he began chasing." A flicker of confusion passed Carrington's face. "What do you talk about?" Jalen took another step forward. "If I allow myself, I would like to submit an inquiry from this night to check Officer Lewis's GPS protocol. If his report says he saw me in the car, it needs to correspond to the history of the place." But he let the words hang into the air. "I feel it's going to be T/. The marbles in the gallery are now bigger." Grayson frowned and looked at Carrington. "Advisor?" Carrington cleaned his throat and chin. "This report was submitted by the act on their honor. Would we really take over the defendant's words about a trained expert?" Jalen shrugged almost casually. "If the officials are where he claims, the GPS data proves this. But if he wasn't, he would have left the sentence." Grayson studied him for a long time before turning his eyes to Carrington. "Do prosecutors have problems checking civil servants' GPS protocols?" Carrington hesitated. The break was long enough. Jew's judge noticed. The gallery noticed. And most of all, the judge realized. Jalen caught up quietly. "For years I'd been observing court cases and studying the prosecutors, their tactics, and how they played the system. And there was one thing he knew. If Carrington had confidence in his case, he would not have stagnated." Grayson sighed and rubbed the temple. "Advisor?" Carrington finally shook his head. "There is no objection, Their Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom no longer laughed. The court remained silent, but the tension was roaring. Carrington mixed his papers, his refined self-capacity cracking to the edges. "Your Honor remains the fact that while waiting for a GPS recording, the defendant's fingerprints were found in the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jalen nodded slightly, his face unreadable. "That's true." He took a step forward. "But we can talk about this evidence for a moment." Grayson raised an eyebrow and pointed out that he was continuing. Jalen turned to the Jew degrees and made eye contact with each of them. "I want you to believe I stole them. This is the story you sell. But we think about it logically." He took a deep breath, his sound calm and controlled. "Go to a department store and try out a jacket. They place their hands in their pockets, perhaps confusing them, then place them again in the frame and go outside. A few hours later, someone will copy this jacket. Does the fact that your fingerprint is on it mean that you stole it? Several Jew apprentices replaced the appearance. Someone in the gallery took a breath and muttered something. Jalen did not give them time to recover. The car in question was parked 7 years ago, 7 hours before theft. I was at this restaurant with 3 friends. And yes, I leaned over it as we passed the car. It had already been unlocked, so I opened the door too. I didn't think it was much needed about the car. It didn't drive it, stole anything from the inside out. A stupid moment of curiosity. He let it sit for a moment. Then he asked in a voice that would cut you silent like a female. Carrington cleaned his throat, pushed through his notes, searching for something to regain control. Jalen wasn't finished. We will also explain how this fingerprint analysis was performed while addressing this topic. He turned to Grayson. Was the forensic expert in charge of this case? Grayson blinked, shocked at the question. He looked at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated and then reluctant. Jalen's lips pressed together. Let me clarify. The state uses forensic evidence to blame me, but did they not think they needed to bring in the actual experts who process this evidence? Have I ever had the opportunity to look into it, seek a custody chain, or question the accuracy of the analysis? Carrington's pines were stuck. Jalen nodded. That was all he had to ask. Interesting. Judge Grayson sighed and pushed the bridge of his nose. It was the man's appearance that he realized that this incident was not an easy victory he accepted. But Jalen wasn't enough, because the next thing he wanted to say will change everything. Jalen moved slowly. Your Honor, I am pleased to have him prove the official description of the car owner. Judge Grayson frowned. Owner? Jalen nodded. Yes. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, registered owner of the stolen Audi, gave police an explanation that was not presented in the prosecutor's submission. And I think I know why. He turned to Carrington. Remember what Mr. Whitaker said to staff when his car was reported? Carrington's pines collided. He knew exactly what was coming. Jalen didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript from his file and read it out loud. I drove when I drove to the gas station. Children must intervene and accept it. But that wasn't the type you arrested. I looked at the kids and he was white. A collective shortness of breath passing through the courtroom. Jalen kept the paper. This is from the original police report. The same law enforcement report is not mentioned. He returned to Judge Grayson. The arrest officer admitted this from his certificate. The prosecutor ignored it. Still, they want this Jew decided to believe that I don't even match the explanation of the real thief. Carrington moved forward. Your Honor is irrelevant. The accused was caught up in possession of the vehicle. However, Jalen shook her head. No, I wasn't. His voice didn't rise, but she managed to get through the courtroom with sharp accuracy. I was arrested for how the car was abandoned and then returned home after getting snacks with a friend. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. Above all, nothing went. The only thing that connects me about this incident is bad work and assumptions from the police. Judge Grayson slowly went outside and rubbed his temple. The case quickly disbanded and everyone knew it. Jalen turned his eyes to the Jew apprentice again. The real suspect ran away that night. Officials found black children in the same common area and determined this was close enough. That's really what it is. Please be silent. Grayson cleaned his throat and placed his glasses on. Is the prosecutor going a little further? Carrington was stiff, and his face was rinsing. No, Your Honor. Judge Grayson let out a sigh. He looked at Jalen for a long time, then Judge. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words he was with everyone in this room. Fall out. A shocking silence blow and confusion. Half of the courtroom broke some incredibly. The gallery moved, reporters scribbled into their notebooks. Jalen didn't move anytime soon. He calmed the moment and brought reality to everyone. Judge Grayson, still on the hammer, looked at Jalen with a free expression. In his eyes, you might probably regret not being there before detection. Jalen met his eyes and then went. But when he reached the door, the judge spoke again. Mr. Dawson. Jalen stopped, but did not turn. Grayson hesitated and finally said, You need to consider legal teachers. Jalen Glynn. He didn't need to consider that. He was already in the middle. Outside the court building, the air was thick with voices. Reporters raved about the stairs, cameras flashing, and microphones advanced like weapons. Jalen, did you know that the judge would refuse the case? What will you do next? How do you feel over controlling an experienced prosecutor? Jalen pulled his hoodie over his head and ignored the question. He was not interested in the view. This was not to prove how smart he was. It was about something big. His mother, Dennis, was waiting for him at the end of the stairs. Her arms were intertwined, and her face was indecipherable. She saw him for a long time. Then she finally shook her head and let out a breath. "Boy, you scared me until half-death." Jalen laughed, hurting the back of her head. "M.A." She stared at him for another moment before hugging him. They have always been permanent. The camera continued to flash, but Jalen no longer paid attention to them. On the other side of the street, Richter Grayson stood in his car. His attitude was different now. A rarity is gone. His expression was no longer interesting. It was something else, approaching a reflection. He didn't think the case was routine and would be more than just another day, another defendant, another guilty request. But now he knew he remembered it. Jalen was doing things that most people couldn't have, so he let the system see himself. And exceptionally, it blinked first. The lessons to learn are: how many other cases did this method do? How many people have been blamed for the evidence, but because of the system that worries bias, links, and more closure cases than finding the truth? Jalen had the knowledge to protect herself, but what about those who didn't? This was not just a case. It was about everyone. He knew what he had to do next. This courtroom would not be the last one. However, next time he would not be the accused. He is a lawyer, and when this day came, he wasn't alone. If you've even thought about this story a little, share it. The judicial system is based on law, but is governed by humans, and people can change. But only when we do that. Click this button to subscribe to more important stories and continue the conversation. Maybe the next one isn't Jalen. It could be someone you know.